When I walked into the nursery, I expected to find my daughter asleep. Instead, I found Emma, eyes heavy with exhaustion, arms wrapped around my little girl, and a blanket laid out on the hardwood floor. She was ready to spend the night there, just to hear my child breathe. And I had to ask myself, what kind of person does that? The grandfather clock in the hallway released 12 measured chimes that seemed too loud for a house that had learned to sleep lightly since a baby arrived. Alexander eased the front door shut and let the lock settle without a click. The trip briefcase hung heavy at his side, a useless prop from a day he'd abandoned the moment the call came. Isabella's fever spiking, breathing fast. He hadn't argued. He'd ended the meetings, signed what needed signing, and chartered a jet home. Now the silence was so complete, he could hear his own pulse in his ears as he started up the stairs. Chicago already felt like a bad idea he'd had in another lifetime. The pediatrician had said, common respiratory infection, the sort of phrase designed to calm a parent whose mind leaps to worst-case scenarios. But the words hadn't stayed with him as the plane cut through night. What held was the picture of his daughter's small chest rising too quickly, and the memory of the last time he'd watched someone he loved fight for breath on a night he could not control. He paused, one hand on the banister, and steadied himself against the old ache of Victoria's absence. Since Isabella was 6 months old, the house had been his to keep upright, boardroom on one shoulder, nursery on the other, and there were still nights when the balance felt fragile. On the landing, the air changed, warmer, scented faintly with baby soap and eucalyptus. Down the nursery hall a nightlight threw a pale oval onto the carpet, a harbor light cutting through his worry. He took the next step slower, listening. Soft murmurs drifted through the slightly open door, the kind of voice you use when you are trying to convince a child that comfort is not a rumor, but a promise kept breath by breath. He stopped at the threshold and looked in. The room glowed, stars scattered across the ceiling, a cot of pink blankets, the rocking chair moving in a gentle arc. Emma sat there, cradling Isabella against her shoulder, her cheek tilted toward the tiny temple she was monitoring with a nurse's rhythm and a guardian's tenderness. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, barely above the hush of the chair. "The medicine will help. I'm right here." A knot he hadn't admitted to tightened, then eased a fraction. Fear is a physical thing for a parent. It lives behind the sternum and climbs the throat when a child's breath falters. Watching them, Emma's steady hand, Isabella's flushed but drowsy face. He felt the pressure shift into something he could hold and manage. He noted the details the way he always did. Emma's hair pulled back without vanity, her sweatshirt creased from hours of use, the small basket of thermometers and strips, and a notepad on the table. None of it looked staged for a returning employer. All of it looked used. Necessary. True, he thought, not for the first time, about why he had hired her 6 months ago when the house had turned from a place to sleep into a place that needed tending. Her references had been impeccable. Her training in pediatric wards meant she could read a fever chart the way he read a quarterly report, and Isabella had leaned into her within minutes, as if she recognized a frequency of care adults can only describe afterward. Tonight, those reasons resolved into a single, simpler fact. Emma was the person in this house who stayed when staying was hard. He stepped inside, letting the door keep its narrow gap so the hinge wouldn't protest. The rocking slowed but didn't stop. Emma lifted her eyes to him, and their conversation happened first in expression. "She's sleeping. The fever is breaking. I won't move until I'm sure." He nodded once. "I'm here. Keep going." The memories rose unbidden. Victoria standing in another pool of nightlight, exhausted and luminous, refusing to surrender their daughter to discomfort. Back then he had learned how love looks when it's tired. Not grand, not dramatic, just persistent. He had been afraid, after the accident, that Isabella would never know that kind of presence again. The sight in front of him argued otherwise, and the relief that came with that argument nearly buckled his knees. He edged closer, each step a negotiation with the instinct to scoop his daughter up and hold her until morning. He bent, brushed a fingertip across the back of Isabella's hand, felt the heat that was no longer blazing. He let out a slow breath. He didn't realize he'd been rationing. Emma's voice threaded the quiet. "She dozed off about 10 minutes ago," she murmured, the consonants softened so they wouldn't jar the air. Breathing's more even. The chair creaked, a sound that had begun to mean safety in this room. Alexander set the briefcase down, as if laying aside the last emblem of the world that had not mattered since the phone rang. He straightened and let the moment imprint. His child safe for now, the caretaker who had carried the night, and himself, present, not delegating, not watching from an airport lounge or a conference call. The house had been waiting for this configuration to make sense again. He met Emma's eyes and formed the words slowly, quietly, so the room would accept them. I'm here. It was a report, a promise, and a permission to himself. The night would go on. He would, too. The rocking chair whispered in the corner, its rhythm nearly as steady as the faint rise and fall of Isabella's chest. Emma had not looked away from the child in hours, her hand resting lightly on Isabella's back, as if her touch alone could steady the fever's sway. The nightlight painted everything in muted amber, the stuffed animals lined along the shelf, the pink curtains drawn against the city, the mobile that swayed above the crib though no breeze stirred. Alexander lingered by the door, unwilling to break the scene too soon. He saw the fatigue in Emma's posture, the slight forward slump of her shoulders, the stubborn straightness in her spine that kept her from leaning fully back. He could tell she had been there since evening, holding and soothing without pause. She turned when she sensed him, her voice pitched in a whisper, careful not to disturb the child who had finally surrendered to sleep. "Mr. Hartwell," she said softly, her eyes shadowed but alert. "Her fever broke about an hour ago. Her breathing is much better, but I didn't want to leave her alone." He crossed the room slowly, careful with every sound. "Thank you," he murmured, his gaze fixed on Isabella's flushed but calmer face. The gratitude in his voice was more than courtesy. It was the raw relief of a father who had been absent and afraid. Emma nodded toward the corner of the room. Only then did he notice the makeshift bed she had arranged, pillows laid on the hardwood floor, a folded blanket brought from her quarters. Alexander's brow furrowed. "Where were you planning to sleep?" he asked. Emma hesitated, then admitted, "Here, beside the crib. I'll hear her if her breathing changes, if she stirs or coughs. It's the best way to keep her safe tonight." She gestured at the small nest of bedding, a practical solution born of devotion. The image unsettled him. He imagined her curled on the floor, restless and uncomfortable, every muscle aching by morning. For a brief second, he saw not the professional nanny he employed, but a young woman sacrificing her own comfort without hesitation because she loved his child enough to endure anything. That realization pressed into him more heavily than the day's travel had. "Emma," he said, his voice low but firm, "that is incredibly dedicated of you, but I can't allow you to sleep on the floor." She lifted her chin, and though exhaustion softened her eyes, her resolve was plain. "You're not asking me, sir. I'm choosing this. Isabella needs someone watching closely tonight, and I want to be the one to make sure she has that care." The quiet strength in her words left him without a quick answer. He looked again at his daughter, the slight furrow between her brows even in sleep, and then back to Emma, who rocked her gently with an endurance that came from more than duty. Something in the room shifted for him. He had seen loyalty in employees, efficiency in staff, and responsibility in colleagues, but this was different. This was not contractual. It was maternal in the truest sense, unbought, uncoached, and unmeasured. And it was here, in his house, sustaining the little girl who had already lost so much. Alexander drew a steady breath, knowing he would have to insist, yet also recognizing that Emma's willingness mattered more than his authority. The night had revealed something essential about her, something that would stay with him. Alexander stood for a long moment, his hand brushing the carved edge of the crib as if the wood could anchor him. The sight of Emma's determination stirred something deep, pride at her devotion, unease at her self-neglect, and an ache that he could not ignore. He thought of how many times he had excused himself from moments like this, citing meetings and contracts, convincing himself that providing for Isabella was enough. But now, watching Emma ready to surrender her night on the hardwood floor, he felt the heavy reminder. He was not just a provider. He was her father. "Emma," he said finally, his tone gentler now, "I want you to put Isabella in her crib and go get some sleep." Her head turned sharply, confusion crossing her face. "Sir, I really think someone should stay with her tonight. Her breathing is steadier. Yes, but children can turn quickly. The doctor said these next 12 hours are important." "I know," Alexander replied, his voice quiet but unyielding. "And that is why I'll be the one here. Not you." Emma's brows knit together. Mr. Hartwell, you just flew back from Chicago. You must be exhausted. It's not fair for you two. Not more exhausted than you are after staying awake with her for 2 straight days, he interrupted, his voice carrying a steel that surprised even him. He drew in a breath and let it out slower. Emma, you have gone above and beyond what anyone could ever expect. But now it's my turn. I am her father. Tonight, she needs me. The rocking chair stilled. Emma looked down at Isabella, then back at him, searching his face for signs of wavering. But what she found was certainty, not the commanding confidence of a CEO, but the resolve of a man reclaiming his place at his daughter's side. She shifted reluctantly, the child warm against her chest. Are you sure you know what to watch for? The fever schedule, the signs of distress. Alexander offered a small smile, his hand resting over Isabella's tiny fist. I think I can manage. But if it makes you feel better, I'll promise to wake you the moment I see anything that worries me. Emma's lips pressed together, her nurse's instinct to control the situation warring with her trust in him. At last she nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. Yes, sir. That would make me feel better. With infinite care, she transferred Isabella into the crib, her movements precise and protective. The little girl stirred once, murmuring in half-sleep, before settling beneath the pink blankets. Emma lingered, tucking the edges securely, brushing a wisp of hair from Isabella's forehead. Alexander watched, struck again by how instinctively Emma cared for his daughter, how naturally she provided the kind of comfort he had feared Isabella might never know after losing her mother. But tonight, he would not step aside. Tonight, he would be the one to keep vigil. Go rest, Emma, he said softly. You've done more than enough. Let me do this. For the first time all night, Emma allowed herself to straighten fully, fatigue showing in every line of her body. She gave one last look at Isabella, then at him, her expression a mix of caution and trust. Finally, she whispered, "Good night, Mr. Hartwell." As she slipped quietly from the room, Alexander sank into the rocking chair she had just vacated, the weight of responsibility settling on him, but not as a burden. As he watched Isabella's steady breathing in the dim light, he felt something else, the unshakable clarity that this, and not the boardroom or the jet, was where his truest work lay. The nursery settled into silence after Emma's footsteps faded down the hallway. Alexander remained still in the rocking chair, his eyes fixed on the crib where Isabella lay. The soft nightlight painted her cheeks a faint rose, but the frantic flush of fever was gone. Her tiny chest rose and fell in an even rhythm now, each breath sounding like a fragile promise that he dared not take for granted. He leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath his weight, and allowed himself a long breath. The adrenaline of the flight home, the anxious rush up the stairs, the tension of persuading Emma, all of it eased into a quiet hum that lingered in his muscles. He was tired, more than he wanted to admit, but the exhaustion could wait. His daughter came first. The room around him seemed to hold echoes of a different time. He remembered Victoria sitting in the same chair, her hair falling loose around her shoulders as she rocked their infant through long nights of colic. She would hum, never words, just a low melody that seemed to soothe Isabella even before she knew voices. Back then, Alexander had stood in the doorway, much as he had tonight, feeling both gratitude and helplessness. He had promised himself he would learn, that he would never let Victoria shoulder the burden alone. But fate had stolen the chance before he could prove it. His gaze shifted to the folded blanket on the floor, Emma's improvised bed. The sight pulled at him. She had been prepared to give up her own rest, her own comfort, just to listen for Isabella's breathing. That kind of devotion was rare, and it struck him with a mix of humility and guilt. He had hired Emma because her qualifications had been perfect, but what kept her in this house was something no resume could measure. It was heart. Alexander let his elbows rest on his knees, clasping his hands together, and whispered into the quiet, "You're safe, Bella. Daddy's here." The words were more for him than for her, a reminder that he was not absent, not distracted, not chasing profits while someone else held vigil. He could be the one who stayed. The minutes stretched into hours. Every so often he stood to check her forehead with the back of his hand, just as Emma had done. The fever had retreated, leaving only a slight warmth. Each time he touched her, relief washed through him, steadying the doubts that had lived with him since Victoria's accident. Could he raise a child alone? Could he balance the weight of a company and the needs of a little girl who deserved everything? Tonight, in the dim glow of the nursery, the answer whispered back to him. Yes, if he chose to show up like this. At one point, Isabella stirred, her hand twitching against the blanket. Alexander leaned close, whispering, "Shoo, it's all right." She calmed almost instantly, her breath evening out again. He stayed there, kneeling by the crib, until he was certain she was deep in sleep once more. When he returned to the chair, he found himself smiling faintly, the kind of smile that came from relief rather than joy. The house around them was vast and silent, filled with the wealth he had earned and the emptiness he could never spend away. But here, in this room, wealth meant nothing. What mattered was presence, his and Emma's. Together, they had kept the night steady for a little girl who deserved to feel loved, even in sickness. As dawn began to tease the edges of the curtains, Alexander realized he had not slept at all. Yet the fatigue did not weigh on him as heavily as he expected. He felt anchored by the simple act of staying, of proving to himself that he could be both father and protector without leaning too heavily on others. He looked once more at Isabella, then at the empty blanket on the floor where Emma had been willing to sacrifice her comfort. "Thank you, Emma," he whispered to the empty room, his voice quiet but full. "You've given us more than you know." And as the first threads of morning light touched the nursery walls, Alexander closed his eyes briefly, his hand resting on the arm of the chair, content to let the day begin around the promise he had kept. The smell of oatmeal drifted through the hall, warm and faintly sweet, tugging Alexander out of the light doze he had slipped into just before sunrise. His back ached from the rocking chair, but he hardly noticed. Isabella was still sleeping soundly, her cheeks cool against the pillow, the fever entirely gone. He stood quietly, reluctant to break the peace, and after one last look at her steady breathing, he stepped into the hallway and closed the nursery door with care. Downstairs, the kitchen was already alive with the quiet industry that Emma brought to every morning. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl, the gentle cadence of someone who made even simple tasks precise. When Alexander entered, she looked up from the counter where she was stirring oatmeal, her hair tied back neatly though shadows of fatigue lingered under her eyes. "How's our patient this morning?" she asked, her tone hopeful, almost cautious. Alexander poured himself a glass of water before answering, letting the coolness ground him. "Much better. No fever, no labored breathing." She woke up asking for her stuffed elephant. He allowed himself a smile, brief but genuine. "I think we can call the crisis over." Relief bloomed across Emma's face, brightening her tired features. "I'm so glad. Respiratory infections in little ones can be frightening, but Isabella is strong. She'll bounce back quickly." He nodded, studying her for a long moment. She had shed the professional distance he had once noticed in her. This was not an employee speaking clinically about a patient. This was someone deeply invested, her heart threaded into every word. And he realized the moment had come to say what he had been turning over in his mind during the night. "Emma," he began, setting the glass down. His voice carried more weight than he intended, and she straightened slightly, cautious. "I want to talk to you about last night." Her hands paused on the bowl, the spoon resting mid-stir. He saw the flicker of worry cross her face, as though she feared she had overstepped her role. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked quietly. He shook his head at once. "No. Quite the opposite. What you were willing to do for Isabella, staying up all night, preparing to sleep on the floor, monitoring her every breath, that went far beyond your job. That was the kind of care only someone who truly loves a child would provide." Emma lowered her eyes briefly, and when she lifted them again, they were glassy with emotion. "Sir, I do love Isabella. She isn't just my job. She's a little girl who has already lost her mother. I want her to always feel safe, always cared for." The sincerity in her words pierced through him, dissolving the last remnants of distance he had tried to keep. He felt his throat tighten, memories of Victoria flashing again. Her laughter, her tireless devotion, the life they had built that ended too soon. For months he had lived with the fear that Isabella would grow up missing that warmth, that she would learn care only as a duty given by strangers. Now, standing across from Emma, he realized that fear no longer held. "Emma," he said, and his voice was low, roughened with gratitude. You've given her something I was afraid she'd never have again. To be loved by someone who chooses her, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. Emma blinked, wiping quickly at her eyes. Caring for Isabella has been the most rewarding work of my life. She's an amazing little girl. He held her gaze, letting the silence speak the rest. There was more he needed to say, but the words felt heavy, important enough to be given in the right moment. For now, it was enough that she knew how deeply he valued what she had given his daughter and him. Emma turned back to the counter, stirring the oatmeal again, but the tremor in her hands betrayed how much his words had reached her. For Alexander, it was a moment of clarity. The recognition that their home was not just being held together by his wealth or his effort, but by the presence of someone who had freely chosen to love a child who was not her own. He stood in the quiet kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counter, and knew with certainty that this was no longer about employment. It was about family. Alexander remained in the kitchen long after Isabella had eaten her breakfast, watching the sunlight spill across the counter as Emma tidied up. She moved with the same efficiency she always did, wiping down the table, rinsing the bowl, setting everything neatly in order. But there was a quiet hesitation to her, as if she was still replaying his words from earlier. He had not planned to speak so openly that morning, but the night had left him with no other choice. Sitting in the nursery, watching Emma's willingness to sacrifice her comfort had crystallized something in him. This was not just about gratitude. It was about what Isabella needed for the years to come. Emma, he said finally, breaking the silence. She looked up, drying her hands on a towel, cautious but attentive. Yes, sir. He stepped closer, resting one hand on the back of a chair, grounding himself. I've been thinking about this for months, but last night confirmed it for me. You're not just a nanny to Isabella. You're something more, and I want to make that official. Her brow furrowed slightly, as though unsure what he meant. Official. I would like to offer you a permanent position here, not simply as her caregiver, but as her guardian and companion, Alexander said, his tone deliberate, steady. It would come with a substantial increase in salary, full benefits, everything you could need. But more than that, it would come with the understanding that you are not just an employee in this house. You are an essential part of Isabella's family. For a moment, Emma didn't move, her eyes searching his face for signs of formality or exaggeration. Sir, what exactly are you asking me? Alexander's gaze softened. I'm asking if you would consider staying with us permanently, helping me raise Isabella as she grows. I'm asking if you would be the maternal figure in her life, the one she needs and deserves. The words filled the kitchen like a tide, and Emma's lips parted as if she couldn't quite contain her emotions. Her eyes shone with tears that caught the light streaming through the window. Mr. Hartwell, you're offering me everything I've ever wanted. The chance to watch Isabella grow up, to be part of her life, not just for a few years, but for as long as she needs me. Then you'll accept? His voice, though calm, carried a quiet urgency. She pressed the towel to her face, wiping away tears, and when she lowered it, her smile trembled but held steady. Yes, yes, I will absolutely accept. The relief that surged through Alexander was almost physical, loosening something in his chest he hadn't realized was bound so tightly. He exhaled, a small smile breaking across his usually reserved expression. Thank you, Emma. You've given us both more than I could ever repay. Emma shook her head quickly. There's nothing to repay. Caring for Isabella has been the greatest gift of my life. At that moment, a sound echoed from the staircase. Isabella's small, cheerful voice calling for her elephant again. Emma and Alexander shared a brief look, one of mutual understanding, before Emma hurried to the stairs, her face bright with joy. Alexander remained in the kitchen for a beat longer, feeling the shift within him. It was as if the house itself had settled differently, its walls holding not just memories of loss but the beginnings of something whole. What had started as an employment arrangement had become family, not through wealth or contract, but through love freely given and recognized. He followed Emma toward the stairs, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Knowing he had secured for Isabella something far more precious than security, he had secured her the love of someone who had chosen to stay. The house had changed in quiet, telling ways over the years. The pink nursery had given way to a bedroom washed in purples and yellows, walls covered with drawings of castles, dragons, and animals, each one proudly signed in uneven letters, Isabella. The rocking chair still stood in the corner, though now it was more often used for reading stories than for soothing fevers. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene inside with the same quiet reverence he had felt that first night he returned from Chicago. Isabella, now 7, sat cross-legged on her bed, a book propped against her knees. Her voice, careful and deliberate, carried the words aloud. The princess raised her sword and faced the dragon without fear. Beside her, Emma sat with her back against the headboard, one arm draped loosely around the girl's shoulders. She listened with patient pride, her eyes flicking between the page and Isabella's expression, gently mouthing the longer words when the child stumbled. "Daddy," Isabella called suddenly when she noticed him in the doorway. Her face lit up, her brown eyes alive with excitement. "I'm reading Emma the story about the princess and the dragon. She says I'm getting really good at the big words." Emma smiled, nodding in confirmation. "She's right. Isabella's an excellent reader." Alexander stepped into the room, his heart swelling at the sight. It was a mirror of the night so long ago, Emma beside his daughter, offering the quiet strength of her presence. Only now, Isabella was not a feverish toddler in need of constant vigil, but a confident child, thriving under the love that had become her foundation. As Isabella finished the page, she set the book aside and leaned against Emma's shoulder, her voice soft but serious. "Emma, will you always be here to take care of me?" The question hung in the air, and Alexander felt the weight of it as deeply as Emma must have. Emma brushed a strand of hair from Isabella's forehead, her smile tender, her voice steady. "Always, sweetheart, for as long as you want me here." Isabella sighed with contentment, curling closer to her, and within minutes her breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. Alexander moved quietly, tucking the blanket around his daughter's small frame. He bent to kiss her forehead, then looked across the bed at Emma. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. She had long since ceased to be an employee. She was family. As he stood in the doorway once more, watching the woman who had chosen his daughter all those years ago, Alexander reflected on the truth the years had revealed. Wealth had brought him houses, jets, influence, but none of it could give his daughter the one thing she truly needed. That gift had come from Emma's willingness to sleep on a hardwood floor, to put Isabella's well-being before her own comfort, and to love her unconditionally. Money could never buy that kind of devotion. All he could do was recognize it, honor it, and protect it for as long as life allowed. The clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking another hour in a life no longer defined by loss, but by the family they had chosen to become. Alexander lingered for a moment longer, then whispered, almost to himself, "Thank you, Emma." Emma looked up at him from the bedside, her expression calm and knowing, and in that quiet exchange, everything was understood.